Hello, everybody, and welcome back to IS323. I'm Bill Smith, the director of the Martin Newton Bohr Foundation. Happy to be talking to you about regional approaches in the Americas. Oh, let me get that just a minute. Hello. Oh, it's me from the future. Me from the future. Thanks for calling. Well, what do you have to say to me? Yes, I know it's a global economics class, but this is a regional. Okay, I will. I'll clarify it. Thanks, me from the future. Okay, me from the future wants to make sure you understand that even though it's a global economics class, economic governance class, that some regional organizations interface with the global system quite effectively and then are able to avoid that trap that we've looked at in earlier lectures about all the decision making resting in the hands of the larger economic powers. So in this case, there will be investment and involvement from those big economic powers, but the decision making will rest in the region. So that's what we're going to talk about here with the Americas, and away we go. All right, so when we're looking at the Americas, the first thing to consider is that we're used to looking at the map with the Americas off to the left-hand side and the rest of the world off to our right. But there's no rhyme or reason for where you draw the center of the map. And in fact, if you look at the map this way, with the Americas resting largely on the right-hand side, that you see that there's the Pacific Rim presents interesting opportunities, particularly for trade and economic integration. So one question when you're looking at regional approaches in the Americas is it really logical to just limit yourself to the Americas? So we're used to there being an Atlantic world, and so, for example, the Atlantic Forum is a really important think tank about geostrategic and geoeconomic approaches to integrating the Atlantic world. There's also a Pacific Council that operates on the West Coast and looks at ways to integrate the Pacific region. So one of the ways this happens is through a regional economic body called APEC, or the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. It's a little awkward because there's not a cooperation forum or anything, it's just called APEC. And every year they host a major economic forum. This year in 2022, that'll be held in Thailand. And the point of that is to look for ways to integrate across the region. So this movement is largely started with the involvement in the Americas of Chile. Chile reaching out and partnering with other countries on the other side of the Pacific. And that through that conversation leading to the development of a really interesting grouping of Latin American, North American, Asian, and Oceanic states that collaborate on a wide variety of issues. So they're trying to lower tariffs. They're trying to make opportunities for transport better. And out of those sorts of conversations comes what almost happened in the 2010s. The Trans-Pacific Partnership would have been the largest economic alliance in the world. So this, again, starts with the conversation with Chile. Chile involved with New Zealand, with Singapore, and with Brunei. And so that's a really interesting grouping because while Chile and New Zealand might be looked at as mid-tier powers, certainly Singapore and Brunei, they're two of the smallest countries in the entire world geographically. But they happen to be really excellent at having converted their economies to one of financial centers where lots of global investment is brokered, where a lot of trade passes through and a lot of money passes through. And so they have economic power that's outsized to their physical geographic size. And so they're part of this conversation. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was to be an agreement between 12 countries, all of whom signed. So international treaty making, there's two main steps. One is a signatory step. That's where the head of state agrees to join a union. But then they have to ratify that signature. And in the United States, where we have a division of powers, the ratification takes place through the Senate. And it looked pretty promising in 2016, though there was opposition. So here's one of these peculiar things where this kind of trade agreement was largely seen through most of U.S. history from World War II to 2018 as being the purview of Republicans, that this was a Republican initiative, the idea of free trade, of open barriers abroad, because the thought was that the development of that kind of free trade would favor the United States, and that it wasn't just transactional, like one trade for one trade, but that our geographic goals, our political goals, our economic goals would all be favored by having this sort of free trade thing. But the Trump administration flipped that. And so what you ended up with was a Democratic president, Barack Obama, signing his intent to join the agreement. And the agreement was only going to be valid when at least the number of member states equal to 85% of the total economic power in the region was reached. Without the United States, you can't reach 85%. So it really was a case where you needed the U.S. in. That Trump flipped it. He decided that in the transactional approach he took to international relations, a direct dollar investment for dollar out, that he didn't really care about the other stuff we were interested in. Had historically been interested in, including under Republican administrations. So he erases the signature essentially in 2017, so we don't do it. And so the Trans-Pacific Partnership almost happens as a way to have really interesting global economic governance structure that combined elements of the Americas, Oceania, and Asia. So what essentially happens is when this falls apart, APEC is still there. This organization continues to exist. And there are other smaller agreements that bind the two regions together. But you do end up with an economic agreement, a free trade area that just is led largely by China instead of largely by the United States. So a lot of the things on the environment and on labor rights and stuff that we would have had in, and we did have in, dropped out of it. So it's interesting in that this is the kind of thing when people say that someone like me is often a leftist in terms of U.S. Politics. I've been talking about free trade areas for my whole career, which was not part of my political ideology, but it's one where the far left is critical of that. For example, Bernie Sanders was really supportive of the United States pulling out of it under Trump. He thought it was great that we didn't do it. And that there was a centrist sort of group that favored it, and then the Republicans disliked it. So it was a Republican position, and now it's not. And so if I or someone like me talks about it as a good idea, then I haven't changed a position or changed the way I teach it, but I've sort of de facto changed political orientation in the United States. Very confusing, very interesting. So anyway, this idea that there's a Pacific region is an interesting one to consider in the Americas. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Caribbean is really complex, and the Caribbean doesn't get taught very often or about very often in most U.S. education because it's sort of the other region. So when you take a Latin American history class, for example, I think I mentioned last time I visited with you about the G7, G8, etc., that at the UN, the region's called GRULAC, and GRULAC stands for the Group of Latin American and Caribbean States, because the Caribbean has non-Latin countries in it. Jamaica, for example, is an Anglophone country. English is the spoken language. That's not Latin American. And then Puerto Rico, which is a Latin sort of place, but it's part of the United States. They speak Spanish, but they're in the United States. You have Dutch territories, French territories, Spanish territories, US, UK. It's really complicated. So there are 13 countries in the Caribbean, but 15 dependencies. And there's also 4 mainland locales in Belize, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana that are physically not located in the Caribbean, but act for all purposes like Caribbean economies and countries in regional blocks and regional meetings. So it's really quite complex and complicated. The reason for that is that they became independent about the same time as most of the smaller states, the Lesser Antilles, did in the 60s and 70s instead of way back in the 1820s like the rest of the Americas. So one of the things that gets complicated here is that one of the global economic governance structures in the Americas, specifically in the Caribbean, is the European Union. And you've certainly heard and read about the EU in this class. Soon our colleague Florian Justwan is going to deliver a European version of this lecture to you. He may not include these, but so keep in mind that the outermost region of the EU, this is a formal structure in the EU, includes several Caribbean locales. Guadeloupe and Martinique and Guyana, that's French Guiana, they are fully integrated parts of France, akin to the way Hawaii, even though it's overseas, is fully integrated into the United States. So we have both territories, the United States, and we have states that are overseas. So you would look at a place like Wake Island or Guam or American Samoa. Those are territories that have a different kind of relationship to the United States than Hawaii, which is fully integrated. Same thing here. Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Guyana are fully integrated parts of France, which also has something called overseas countries and territories. And in the EU, these are not fully fledged members of the EU. The EU is not operational in these places. But France has several more of these. So Sint Maarten, Sint Eustatius, Bonaire, And then this one way up here, this is an interesting one. I know this flag here, St. Pierre and Miquelon, looks like it's on mainland Canada. It's actually off the coast, sort of northeast of Maine. There's a couple of French islands. So they have a different sort of relationship, but it also complicates the way you might plan for inter-American economic cooperation, is that there are non-American states that are part of the region, and that the non-American states that are operational here have different levels of integration with those states. So complex, complicated, and a couple of main structures here. So the ones I'm going to talk about today briefly here in the next 5 minutes are the Inter-American Development Bank and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. The other two main ones, but there's lots more, are Mercosur, which is a common market in the southern part of South America, and the Caribbean Community, which is in the Caribbean. But not all states in the Caribbean are in CARICOM, and not all states in South America are in Mercosur. But all states in the region are in the IDB and ECLAC. So the IDB is a development bank that operates very similar to the other banks we've talked about to this point, in the World Bank or the IMF, for those structures where you have each country's share in the bank gives them an equal share of the vote. Now, the difference is that it's the people who need the investment in the region that have the largest say. So even though they won't have the largest share, the people who don't need the money don't get the vote. Okay, so that means in the Inter-American Development Bank, the largest donor is the United States. It doesn't retain the largest share because it doesn't use it, the money out of that fund. Similarly, in the African Development Bank, when we get there, the UK is the largest donor to that bank, but it doesn't get a vote in how the money's spent. Now, one thing this should indicate to you is that probably the banks don't have as much money as the ones where those big countries retain say, and that would be a correct assumption. So they're important and they do a lot of interesting work, but they are less capitalized. That said, if you need a lot of money for a project, the World Bank, the IMF, either for public sector or for big development projects, is better. But if you need more money for more projects, not the same giant amount, then the IDB is a good one. So I just picked Paraguay kind of at random. I've got an alum living there and been thinking about him lately. So in Paraguay, there are 108 active projects there. And I put 4 of them here to give you a kind of a sense of what you're doing. So they're both state building, public sector sort of things, and then development sorts of things. And so that's what Paraguay looks like. A little bit differently, ECLAC operates. So ECLAC is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. There are 5 of these in the world. So if you see that one of the jobs of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations is to create commissions, they have 13 commissions, 8 of which are considered functional commissions. For example, the Commission on the Status of Women, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and then 5 of them are regional economic commissions. So Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, West Asia, Asia and the Pacific, and Africa. So these operate, they more try and coordinate programs and policies as opposed to give money. So they're trying to cooperate. They will get some funding and partner on funding through other UN agencies, try and shape that investment, but they don't have money of their own. So they're working in these areas largely. And they've worked under the lead of a really talented Mexican stateswoman named Alicia Barrera Ibarra since 2008. She's the executive secretary. So this really coordinates money that comes, not money, I'm sorry, programming and plans that come to the UN system. So one of the things they're really focused on is something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you aren't familiar with those, I'm going to put a link in the readings this week is not required, but if you've never seen what the SDGs are, you should click through and see that. So this is work that the UN is doing in different sectors to make sure that progress is being made on a lot of fronts that's kind of cohesive and coherent across the whole UN system. All right, so there's lots of activity that is truly Pan-American through ECLAC and through the IDB. There's also trans-Pacific, transatlantic, and then European and other kinds of investment that's happening through these different development banks. So I do need to make sure that I call myself here in a minute in the past to make sure I clarify how that sort of global economic governance intersects with regional economic governance. But it is a rather complex. Once you get into it, it's not too complicated, except for the parts where they overlap, where it seems like things are happening in multiple places at multiple times. Anyway, gotta go, gotta call myself. Thanks for tuning in tonight. Enjoy.